I'm Trudy Goldberg. I'm chair of the National Jobs for All Coalition. I'm joined by members of our executive committee, whom I think I will introduce to tell you a little bit about them first, and then I'm going to spend a little time on telling you about the National Jobs for All network, its origins, political context, and the work that we do. I'm joined today by Philip Harvey, who is professor of law and economics at the Rutgers Law School and counsel to the board of NJFAN. He's an internationally recognized expert on the law and economics of the right to work, and as he will summarize his paper after I've discussed the coalition. His paper is What is Full Employment and Why the Definition Matters, and we will talk about how the definition matters to us. The other members of the panel are Logan Martinez, our outreach coordinator, who is based in Dayton, Ohio, where he's been a community activist for over 50 years, working on such issues as jobs, housing, utility reform, consumer rights, the environment, and peace. And he maintains a regularly meeting the Jobs for All network, consisting of participants from a number of U.S. states, and that meets bi-weekly. Logan has initiated and co-led our town hall projects, which we'll talk about. Professor Stephen Monroe Tomczak, who called Zach, is professor in the Department of Social Work of the Southern Connecticut State University, based in New Haven, Connecticut. He has an extensive background in social work education and research, particularly in poverty, community organization, and the history of social work and social welfare. Zach and one of his students were the principal organizers of a recent National Jobs for All network town hall in New Haven. Frank Stricker is professor emeritus of history and labor studies of California State University in Dominguez Hills. His publications include two important books, Why America Lost the War on Poverty and How to Win It, and American Unemployment Past, Present, and Future. He also authors articles on such subjects as Why Wages Have Rarely Advanced Much, and recently a monthly commentary on the Bureau of Labor Statistics monthly jobs and unemployment report. I am currently co-chair of the Columbia University Seminar on Full Employment, Social Welfare, and Equity, and chair of NJFAN. I'm professor emeritus of the School of Social Work and former director of its PhD program at Adelphi University. My emphases and my books and articles are on cross-national studies of women's poverty and the welfare state, the New Deal, and popular social movements in the U.S. during and after the Great Depression. Now I want to tell you a little bit about National Jobs for All network. Twice since World War II, the U.S. Congress has seriously considered enacting full employment or a federal job guarantee. The first of the economic rights that President Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed in his landmark Second or Economic Bill of Rights. Both congressional efforts resulted in legislation that fell far short of guaranteeing the right to a job or full employment, as Phil and Harvey will define it in his paper. What is full employment and why it matters? We'll tell you why it matters to us, and that in some ways we expand on that definition. The second congressional attempt to achieve full employment began with the goal of a job guarantee, but ended with the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978 that had an interim 5-year target of 4% unemployment, with the achievement of full employment to follow as soon as possible thereafter. At the 5-year mark, alas, unemployment was 9.6%, instead of the targeted 4%, more than twice the interim target, and was actually double digit for more than a year preceding the interim deadline. After that failure, full employment was not only in political eclipse, but largely out of mainstream research and academic discourse as well. Some leading progressives even disdained it as a policy goal. In the mid-1980s, some academics and activists were still convinced that full employment was a major means of coping with our persistent, formidable social problems. Consequently, they began to consider new initiatives for full employment. We called it NIFE. We held meetings, conferences, and wrote some position papers on the subject. In 1987, Sumner Rosen, a Columbia University professor and leading member of NIFE, proposed and initiated a seminar on full employment as part of the Columbia University Seminars program. Over the years, that seminar has contributed significantly to the development and refinement of thinking about the right to employment and the possibilities for its political resurgence. The seminar, which has included leading thinkers, Nobel Prize laureates, and one of the architects of the Swedish full employment policy, has focused on the analytical and policy issues pertaining to full employment. Now titled the Columbia University Seminar for Full Employment, Social Welfare, and Equity, it has been a resource for conferences, public meetings, and publication of works pertaining to full employment. One such conference was an all-day national gathering at Columbia University in 2013, a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. I think we were among the first to begin to really discuss that landmark legislation in recent times. Seminar presentations and discussions during the early years of both the Columbia Seminar and NIFE influenced the content of a book published in 1994. That book served as a manifesto for the founding of a successor to NIFE, the National Jobs for All Coalition, now called Network, which we think is a name that better describes what we're trying to accomplish. The book is called The Jobs for All, A Plan for the Revitalization of America, and it set forth a plan for full employment with chapters on such topics as adequate income for all, rights of workers, environmental sustainability and preservation, and sound government and finance. The Jobs for All authors acknowledge the contribution of the Columbia Seminar, which had over the years provided us with a forum for presenting research and testing ideas. In fact, we've said that that seminar has helped us to keep alive the dream of full employment. That book is available online at our NJFAN website, and we invite you to visit our website, which is www.njfac.org. The National Jobs for All Network is the only major national organization in the U.S. that has as its central goal the achievement of a federal guarantee of useful living wage employment for all who want to work. We publish an online NJFN newsletter that encourages a wide range of economic and social justice organizations to join a network that includes the fundamental right to living wage work. And it serves as a kind of clearinghouse for their action. We invite you to subscribe to our newsletter and to also tell us about what you are doing and to be part of our clearinghouse. One of our signature efforts is called the Real Count, and Frank Stricker will talk to you about that. It challenges the official U.S. definition of unemployment and emphasizes the political consequences of an official undercount of a social problem. Panelist Frank Stricker, as I mentioned, will discuss that and his monthly commentaries on the official unemployment reports of the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the U.S. Department of Labor. NJFAN members have written numerous position papers and pamphlets. We have published books that made the case for full employment as a major solution to the problems of poverty, racial discrimination, and economic inequality. Our website stores a wide range of material pertinent to full employment, including our book, and we invite you again, as I said, to visit it. We archive monthly unemployment statistics that are very, very important and helpful to researchers. NJFAN board member and counsel Philip Harvey has served as the chief consultant for the only federal job guarantee legislation introduced in Congress since Humphrey Hawkins. It's called HR 1000, the Jobs for All Act. We expect that a revised version of that federal job guarantee legislation will be introduced in Congress in the coming months. At that time, NJFN will educate the public about the legislation and seek congressional co-sponsorship for it, as we did for the earlier versions of that bill. NJFAN has led a series of Jobs for All town meetings that bring together a wide range of economic justice and human rights advocates and encourage their concerted action. The most recent one in New Haven, Connecticut, will be discussed by our panelist, Professor Stephen Monroe Tomczak, and panelist Logan Martinez, who initiated the project and has served as a co-organizer of all of them, will speak about these events as well, and our intent to hold town meetings in more cities across the country. NJFN has also targeted New York City for job guarantee action. A New Deal for the USA and New York City is the title of a series of events, including an all-day conference sponsored by the important Professional Union of the City University of New York, the PSC, the unveiling of a map of New York City sites created by work relief and public works programs of the Great Depression, New Deal programs, the map created by Living New Deal, a research project, an online public archive documenting the scope and impact of the New Deal on American lives and the national landscape. And our New York City events also included a public meeting at New School University, co-sponsored by the Columbia University Seminar, and NJF, and the New School. That series and the New School meeting featured a proposed New York City Jobs for All program designed by NJFAN under the leadership of Phil Harvey and supported by the New York City public advocate Letitia James, then believed to be planning a campaign for mayor of New York City that terminated when she chose to run for the position of New York State Attorney General, now reported to be contemplating a run for the governorship. Noreen Connell, who unfortunately could not be present for this panel, has continued our interest in job creation in New York City, examining the platforms of candidates for mayor in the New York City recent Democratic Party primary. 3 of the 8 major candidates had robust plans for job creation. This reflects, we believe, the new direction in national Democratic politics. None of them, however, had an articulated plan for full employment like the one envisioned by the city legislation that NJFN drafted for the public advocate. We will be analyzing the job creation policies or lack of the Democratic mayoral candidate, of the Democratic candidate for mayor who's likely to be elected mayor. Noreen, who can't be with us, adds that New York City's capital plans are sort of Orwellian. They always promise jobs, but they are driven by real estate interests that want to upgrade their holdings for office buildings and residents so that they have increased value. The upshot is that since the 1920s, these interests significantly have driven out manufacturing and reduced jobs and affordable housing in the city. The participants in our panel I have already introduced, and I'm going to turn over the panel now to Philip Harvey, who will summarize his paper. Panelists, and of course, all of you who are with us are invited. Will comment, and as well as those of you who are listening to participating in our panel. Phil.
Okay. Thank you, Trudy. I'll start with a little bit of international law. The United Nations Charter creates a theoretically binding duty on all member states to promote full employment and to take progressive measures to secure the right to work. The right to work that is the subject of this stated obligation is defined with reasonable precision in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but no similarly authoritative definition of full employment exists. Filling that gap and explaining the practical importance of that term's definition is the purpose of the paper I am presenting today. The chat box for this session includes a list of references and links to the sources of international law to which I have just referred, the provisions of US law stating the federal government's qualified commitment to the promotion of full employment and its unqualified commitment to the fulfillment of the right of all job seekers to decent work. A 204 article in which I explain the importance of this body of law despite the fact that it remains largely unenforced. And finally, my email address for use in requesting copies of the paper I'm presenting today. So let me begin. I hear an echo. I'm causing myself. I'm not sure exactly.
I don't hear it, Phil. Do the rest of you?
Okay. If you're not hearing, I can live with it.
You're unechoed.
Okay. As I just indicated, my purpose in the paper that I'm presenting today is to provide a definition of full employment in order to understand the legal obligation that members of the United Nations have formally assumed to promote its achievement, and to comment on why I believe it is important to be clear about that definition, since I will explain it differs from the way most economists define the term full employment today. So, beginning with some history, the use of the term full employment to describe the optimal macroeconomic condition of a market economy was coined by John Maynard Keynes in his famously influential 1936 treatise, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Prior to the publication of the general theory, economists rarely used the term full employment, and when they did, their usage was generic. The historic literature includes, for example, references to individual workers finding full employment, the full employment of a business firm's credit, the full employment of a firm or industry's capital stock, the full employment of the factors of production by an economic enterprise, the full employment of workers in particular occupations, and so forth. Only in the work of 19th century economic reformers was the term occasionally used to refer to the policy goal of furnishing full employment for all workers. But those precursors of Keynes' usage were too isolated to give the term any special meaning prior to the publication of the general theory. So the general theory introduced the term full employment. Now, as the title suggests, the general theory was a theoretical work addressed to professional economy. And it defines full employment in different ways depending on the specific theoretical context of the reference. However, all of those definitions are consistent with one another, and they are all consistent with a general understanding that the achievement of full employment means that everyone who wants and seeks paid employment in the economy has a job, except for new entrants to the labor force and workers who are between jobs, since they technically count as unemployed until they accept a particular job and start working, no matter how plentiful their job options may be. So full employment, as defined by Keynes, meant jobs for all. Now, since the general theory was written for an audience of professional economists rather than the general public, it took a few years for the concept of full employment that it promoted to enter ordinary public policy discourse. That occurred during World War II, at a time when President Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR as he is commonly known, and other advocates of his administration's so-called New Deal reforms were actively promoting the idea that access to decent employment is a universal human right whose realization constitute the foundation for other progressive economic and social reforms. FDR's 1941 For Freedom speech and his 1944 Economic Bill of Rights speech constituted the clearest articulation of this message. Now, FDR's vigorous championing of the right to work accordingly occurred at the same time the concept of full employment was being popularized by Keynesian economists in the United States. And since the US economy was widely perceived as achieving both of these goals during the 3-year period from 1943 through 1945, when the unemployment rate averaged 1.7%, both the concept of full employment and the realization of the right to work came to be associated in public policy discourse and in the public's mind with the labor market conditions that existed during that 3-year period. In other words, the achievement of full employment and the realization of the right to work were viewed as synonymous with one another. Moreover, as the war drew to a close, progressives were in the enviable position of having two well-tested strategies for achieving these synonymous goals. The older of the two strategies was the one conceived, tested, and partially implemented by New Deal social welfare planners in programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, known as the CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, known as the WPA, which operated in the case of the CCC between 1933 and the early years of 1940, and in the case of the WPA from 1935 to the early years of the 1940s. In both cases, well before Keynes' general theory popularized the second strategy available to progressives for pursuing the achievement of full employment and to secure the right to work following the end of World War II. The originators of the New Deal strategy called it a policy of employment assurance, a predecessor of the job guarantee strategy advocated by a small but growing number of progressive economists today. The strategy relies on direct government job creation to close whatever gap exists at a particular point in time between the number of jobs provided by the private and regular public sectors of an economy and the number and type of jobs needed to provide decent work for all job seekers. The Keynesian strategy, in contrast, relies instead on the use of deficit spending by governments to increase aggregate demand to whatever level is required to induce the private sector to close the economy's job gap via the creation of private sector jobs. Now, not surprisingly, progressives chose to pursue the Keynesian fiscal stimulus strategy rather than the New Deal direct job creation strategy as the foundation of their post-war reform agenda, and to adopt the achievement of full employment rather than the realization of the right to work as the stated goal of that strategy. In retrospect, I believe this was a mistake, but the reasons favoring the decision progressives made appeared quite compelling at the time. First, the Keynesian strategy of writing checks to boost aggregate demand was much easier to administer than the New Deal strategy of establishing and administering a large direct job creation program. Second, the Keynesian strategy and full employment goal were far less controversial than the New Deal strategy and right to work goal. The Keynesian strategy and full employment goal could elicit the support of powerful private sector actors who would benefit from the government business the government's deficit spending would create, whereas the New Deal strategy and right to work goal seemed like the camel's nose of socialism sneaking inside the capitalist tent. In short, the Keynesian full employment strategy appeared to chart an easier path to the achievement of a more readily accepted goal than the New Deal's employment assurance right to work strategy. What this reasoning overlooked was that the Keynesian strategy had several unrecognized disadvantages compared to the New Deal strategy. First, it cost significantly more per created job than the New Deal strategy. Second, it also had inflationary tendencies at the top of the business cycle that the New Deal strategy could more easily counter. Third, It was more susceptible to capture by conservative interests, as illustrated by the growth of the so-called military-industrial complex in the United States during the 1950s, and the success of conservative Keynesians who advocated tax cuts as an alternative to increased government spending as a means of providing the economy with an economic stimulus during recessions. In any event, for 3 decades following the end of World War II, the Keynesian strategy worked reasonably well as a means of achieving sustained full employment. Not in the United States, to be sure, where full employment was never again achieved following the end of World War II, but in Australia, New Zealand, and a number of Western European countries where it provided the foundation FDR predicted it would for the construction of the social democratic welfare state. Unfortunately, this 3-decade success ended in the 1970s when the simultaneous occurrence of what was at the time the worst recession since the 1930s and unacceptably high rates of inflation caused confidence in the Keynesian full employment strategy to collapse. The problem with the Keynesian strategy is that it provided no clear instruction for combating unemployment and inflation when they occurred at the same time. And Keynesian economists threw in the towel rather than going back to the drawing boards to develop an alternative strategy for achieving non-inflationary full employment. Instead, the collapse of the progressive strategy for achieving full employment of that day led to the effective disappearance of full employment from the progressive reform agenda, a trend that is easy to document, but which I don't have time to go over in this presentation. It is referenced in my article. However, in my paper. However, the legal mandates that obligated governments to strive for both the achievement of full employment and the realization of the right to work remained in place at both the international and domestic level. Repudiating those legal mandates would have been difficult given the social and political implications of a public acknowledgement by the leaders of the so-called free world that market economies could not provide jobs for everyone who wanted and needed work. The contradiction between the continued viability in law and the politically ignored full employment goal, and the loss of confidence on the part of most economists in their ability to achieve that goal, was especially awkward for the economics profession. The way most economists resolved this conflict between what the law and popular opinion told them they should strive to achieve and what they thought it possible to achieve was straightforward. They adjusted their definition of full employment to match what they believed it was possible to achieve via the economic policies they felt comfortable advocating. And so the economic profession changed its definition of full employment during the 1980s and 90s by equating it to the minimum level of unemployment an economy could achieve while maintaining reasonable price stability, a goal more accurately described as the non-accelerating inflation rate of employment, or NIRU, a term with a decidedly negative public image, and hence the attraction of redefining full employment, a popular term instead. At first, this trend to change the definition of full employment was resisted by progressive economists. But following the achievement of 4% unemployment at the end of the 1990s by the Democratic administration of President Bill Clinton, well-known progressive economists in the United States began joining the professional consensus that full employment didn't really mean what the term full suggested it means, but something short of that, while still good enough to support wage growth and other progressive economic trends. Now, I readily acknowledge that economists are free to define the terminology they use in their work however they want to, but they owe it to the public to be clear in explaining how they define the terms they use when they engage in public policy debate involving non-economists. And they cannot alter a legal mandate obligating national governments to strive to achieve a particular goal simply by asserting an alternative definition of the goal. Economists may claim ownership of the language of economic theory, but not of the law. And the meaning of full employment in the law was established in the 1940s. I believe that economists who equate full employment with the NAIRU or something akin to the NAIRU have failed to honor these professional obligations, since they rarely explain their definition of full employment to audiences of non-economists and almost never acknowledge that their definition of the term is inconsistent with the meaning attached to it in legal mandates to achieve full employment under both international and domestic law. But why does the definition of full employment matter? I will cite just one reason, the one I consider the most important, namely that by suggesting full employment has been achieved when the economy is millions of jobs short of that goal, and by refusing to acknowledge that additional policies are needed to create enough jobs to actually eliminate involuntary unemployment, economists who equate full employment with the NAIRU or something akin to the NAIRU are not just misrepresenting the truth, they are not just sticking their heads in the sand instead of facing the truth. They are standing in the way of the adoption of policies that actually could achieve full employment, realize the right to work, and thereby restart the engine of progressive economic and social policy reform after 4 decades of neoliberal policy rule throughout the world. The fact that they actively support job creation measures to effectively combat the elevated levels of unemployment that are the consequence of the business cycle does not compensate for their failure to tackle the challenge of developing and supporting the implementation of policies capable of creating the millions of additional jobs needed to achieve full employment across all phases of the business cycle, including the top. In short, they are condemning millions of active job seekers and passive job wanters, among whom disadvantaged individuals and population groups are overrepresented, not just to involuntary unemployment, but to all the harms that decades of research have shown are associated with involuntary unemployment. And they are condemning society to all the social and political harms that flow from unremedied unemployment and the fear of unemployment in a neoliberal world. But are there policies available for achieving true full employment and thereby securing the right of all job seekers to decent employment? Fortunately, this other strategy for achieving full employment developed by progressives during the Great Depression can do that if it is well designed to not only create the needed jobs, but to do it in a way that avoids the inflationary tendencies that led to the abandonment of the Keynesian full employment strategy in the 1970s, except for use as an anti-cyclical measure. It is beyond the scope of my presentation to describe that strategy, this strategy, the New Deal strategy in detail, but my work on it is reflected in the provisions of H.R. 1000, the Jobs for All Act, also known as the Humphrey Hawkins 21st Century Full Employment and Training Act, which I invite you to explore via the link to the most recent version of the bill, which is accessible in the chat box for this session. Before closing, though, I will summarize the features of the bill that are most important to this discussion. And those are the features that make it capable of achieving true full employment without triggering the inflationary tendencies to which the Keynesian full employment strategy fell victim and is prone. First, if the creation of enough jobs to close the economy's job gap is funded using the trust fund model used to fund unemployment insurance benefits in the United States, a direct job creation program can create the additional jobs that are still needed to achieve true full employment once the NAIRU has been reached without adding further to aggregate demand. Thereby eliminating the principal source of the Keynesian full employment strategy's inflationary tendencies while fully preserving the Keynesian strategy's effectiveness in using deficit to combat recessions. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to think that you can close the economy's job gap without adding to aggregate demand, but that's exactly what the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund tends to do. And if a job guarantee were funded using the same kind of mechanism, it could similarly create the needed jobs at the top of the business cycle without increasing aggregate demand. Second, by naturally targeting its job creation effect on individuals who otherwise would be unemployed, a well-designed direct job creation program can avoid the sectoral labor shortages that feed unbalanced wage inflation and hence the price inflation that emerges when full employment is approached via the harder to target the Keynesian full employment strategy. Third, a well-designed direct job creation program could dramatically reduce so-called frictional and structural unemployment, thereby creating more room for non-inflationary economic growth and promoting productivity growth, a natural inflation fighter. Frictional unemployment is the unavoidable employment that would continue to exist even with the achievement of full employment due to the time it takes new entrants to the labor force and workers who are between jobs to explore employment opportunities available to them, to accept a job and to actually start working, during which time they will be counted as unemployed. The amount of time this would take could be greatly reduced via the creation of a more efficient public labor exchange, and the implementation of a direct job creation would provide an ideal basis for establishing such an exchange because of its usefulness in operating the program. So-called structural unemployment is caused in significant part by a mismatch between the skills job seekers possess and the skills private and regular public sector employers are seeking when they need more workers. By investing significant resources in paid job training to satisfy program needs that match the needs of private and regular public sector employers, a direct job creation program could also reduce structural unemployment in the economy, again, creating more room macroeconomically for job growth without causing inflation. Finally, a well-designed and administered direct job creation would also provide private sector employers with a natural inflation-restraining reserve supply of recruitable employees in the job creation program, thereby permitting the program to perform the inflation-fighting function of unemployment without requiring anyone to actually endure unemployment. For these reasons, among others, the New Deal direct job creation strategy commends itself as a desirable alternative to the Keynesian full employment strategy. And if economists, beginning with apostate progressive ones, would abandon their pretense that policies that they currently advocate are capable of achieving full employment, the New Deal strategy is ready and waiting for their support as a truly effective means of achieving that goal while simultaneously securing the synonymous right to a decent job recognized in international human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I was a little late getting on and with some difficulty. Would somebody tell me how to access chats? Do we have any, is there any?
There should be a panel to the right of the screen you are looking at that says chat.
It says chat, but anyway,
if you click on chat, then you will see all of the entries in the chat box, which includes several from me listing various references to work related.
I don't see how to do that. Can anybody else do that?
Yeah, I have access to it.
Okay, I think for now, do we see any questions of Phil? Okay, then I want to move ahead to Frank Stricker to comment. As I said, we're going to comment on the ways in which this definition of full employment informs our work. And I think Frank Stricker will start with that. Frank, unmute yourself, please. You're muted, Frank. I introduced historian Frank Stricker, whose important book on the history of unemployment is just recently published and reviewed in our newsletter, as a matter of fact. Frank, you are still muted. No, I heard your voice. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to make three big and pretty simple points. They're all in my book, American Unemployment, and I think they're all in tune with the things that we in our organization believe. The first one is a kind of historical lesson. The book is about half history and then half contemporary analysis. But the theme, the historical theme that's the most important in the book to me is very simple, and that's that the United States has almost never had real full employment over 150 years, except for wartime spending. There was no free market utopia back in the good old days, as an example, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Just as one example, in the early 1900s, which is sometimes called the progressive era and is thought to be a somewhat prosperous time, three experts estimated the average unemployment in those years was as follows. One said 8.6%, one said 9.8%, and the other 6.9%. So those are general estimates of how much unemployment we had in those good old days. And on, and you could do that for other periods. So, and I try to. So that leads me to the conclusion, which you've already heard about, which is that we never, rarely, if ever, have full employment in the United States. And the times when we do have it are because of major wartime spending. That leads to point two, which is, as Phil already mentioned, there was a time when the United States actually tried to use the direct job creation program to create jobs, and that was the 1930s with famous programs like the WPA and the CCC and several other programs. And the key thing for me wasn't that those programs were perfect. They were racist and sexist. There weren't enough jobs for everybody. The pay was pretty crappy in many cases. But in general, they showed that the United States government, which is often criticized for ineffectiveness, could create millions of jobs and do it quickly. So out of the New Deal's experience with job creation, I conclude that we did it once and we can do it again. There's no reason why we can't, except for lack of confidence and intense obstruction from conservatives and neoliberals and so on. And the final point I'm going to make is about current times, and it's about one of the central contributions of our organization to the conversation about unemployment, and that's our special unemployment rate. We believe that the federal government's unemployment rate severely undercounts unemployment. So that when they say unemployment is 5%, we think it's about 11%. That's pretty much what happened in August. That's the last report we have on unemployment. Official unemployment 5.2, we say 11.1. How do we come up with our number? Actually, it's pretty simple. I don't know who in our organization thought it up, but it's a pretty simple and I think effective method, and that's we take the official unemployment rate and we add two things. Number one, part-time workers who want full-time work, and number two, people who say they want to work but have not recently looked for work. And if you take those two together, and that's how we came up with 11% unemployment in August. One final point about our count is something that's kind of interesting to me, and that's our Fuller count of unemployment does a better job of helping to explain why wages in the United States have been crappy for about 50 years. And even in the last 20 years, in the prosperous periods we had, the average real wage of most American workers has just crept up a little bit, you know, like 1% a year, maybe 1.5%, 0%. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Weak unions, conservative government, a pathetically low federal minimum wage. Our listeners may know that it's $7.25 currently. But the other reason is there's almost always plenty of workers, and way more than it looks like if you take the federal unemployment rate. So there's usually a lot of slack in the employment markets, and that's one reason why employers don't have to raise wages. One of the oddities of the pandemic is that there's plenty of unemployment, but some employers are actually having to raise wages significantly because a lot of people don't want to go back to work right now for a lot of reasons. But anyway, I think our unemployment rate, which is usually double the official one, is a more accurate count of what's going on in the labor market. And it helps to understand why normal labor market functions aren't working to lift wages in America, and why the average wage is pretty stinky. So I think those are my main points.
Frank, thanks, and people can access our real count on our website at any time, even archived for many, many months before. We also, I might add, sometimes include the number of the working poor as part of that. The millions of people who work full-time year-round for less than a paltry 4-person poverty level. Okay, thank you, Frank. And I don't know if I thanked you enough, Phil. I was so worried about the chat box, but thank you. Logan and Zach, which one of you wants to talk about some more of our work that reflects this expanded definition of full employment, which we also add, to which we add living wage work? I think that may be implicit, Phil, but it's very important to us, and we fight for more than 15. Logan or Zach, which one of you wants to talk a little about how we carry this out in our work?
Okay. Like Trudy says, I'm Logan Martinez. I'm in Dayton, Ohio.
Is that called the Midwest or the Near East now? I don't know what the.
Well, it used to be the Old West, but we're the Midwest. But I want to point out with what Frank was talking about, that those numbers are taken directly from the Labor Department's report each month. We're not making this up. With part-time workers, there's over 25 million people working part-time on a regular basis. And what they call the hidden unemployed, people who would like to have a job but are not counted. The Labor Department reports that, and we take that directly from their report. Now, we're in a very unique time. Last June, you know, the whole economy had shut down, and for practical purposes, we were in a pandemic depression. 35 million people were unemployed or underemployed based on our analysis. And like I said, that's all taken from the Labor Department. We don't make these numbers up. But the government, for the first time in modern times, instituted aid to the unemployed that they've never had. In most states, on a regular basis, you're only allowed to receive 50% of what you were making before. But the government added the $300 extra a week, which made a huge difference for people that were unemployed. They also added the stimulus, or the extra money that everybody got, extra checks, whether you were working or not. And that pumped a lot of money into the economy. And for the first time, the unemployed were able to survive. They were able to pay rent, they were able to pay their bills and get by. Now they've pulled that.
Was that the Labor Day present, Logan?
The summer.
The Labor Day present.
Please? Yes, the present right now. For unemployed people, their lives have been turned upside down. Initially, like I said, unemployment insurance was made a safety net that people could survive on. Now they've withdrawn all that over the summer. 22 states took away the extra $300. Over 4 million people were affected by that. And then on Labor Day, another 7.5 million people were cut off completely from unemployment. And removing that safety net means that, for August of this year, as Frank and June work on, there were 18.5 million unemployed or underemployed people across the country. And we could call this a pandemic recession. We are still in that. I've come to believe that we're in a fake workers shortage. Across the news media and across business, they claim that there's a shortage of workers. In reality, not only are they underpaying people they're trying to hire, they're actually not hiring those folks on the scale that they claim they need to. There's for hire signs up all over the place, but they stay up and they don't really fill those positions, have not in a way that really will. Unemployment has gone down, but there's still millions of people who would like to have a good paying job. The pandemic, frontline workers for sure. If you're a frontline worker or people are trying to hire people to work in restaurants and wait on people, there's a reluctance for people to go back to those jobs, but not on the scale that really matters. These are people, friends of ours, family members, all kinds of people who are unable to go back to work because they're really not hiring these folks. Restaurants have closed up across the country. Small businesses have closed up. Theaters have closed up. And we are determined to help folks out. We've, throughout this, linked the issue of full employment with the struggles of poor people and the struggles of working people across the country. We've held 4 town hall meetings now over the last few years in Columbus, Ohio, and Dayton, Ohio, where I live, and in Memphis, Tennessee. We've held town hall meetings, and this 2 weeks ago, we had a town hall meeting in New Haven, which Zach will fill you in on. The unemployed are getting organized for the first time. There are unemployment groups that are working on these issues, particularly in Pennsylvania, here in Ohio, in a number of places. We are networking with those folks, and we encourage people here to if you have unemployed folks, to connect with those groups and get in touch with us. I put our contact information in the chat, and if you want to send us an email or get in touch with us, please do so.
We'd like you to hold a town meeting too, if you're.
Sure, we're going to hold several more town hall meetings, but the situation is bleak, and that the safety net has now been pulled out from underneath these people. The government and the business would like to force people back into these frontline jobs at low wages. They voted down increasing the minimum wage this last summer. There was an effort to raise it to $15, but the Congress, the majority of the people in the Congress, including a sizable number of Democrats, voted against raising the minimum wage. We believe that there's several steps. We're working towards an introduction of a jobs guarantee bill, in which will be the backstop to create real full employment and a jobs for all and a job guarantee. And the National Jobs for All Network is going to be on the front line, making sure that we get to that point. We need a movement. We're in the process of building that movement, and we need your support. So please join with us, and we'll get there together, along with a lot of other issues that the climate, that needs to be done. So
All of which we've said have been intrinsic to job guarantee. We've always said that environmental sustainability is part of our view of a job guarantee, and that it does remove one of the major barriers that is a job guarantee to an all-out attack on climate change, because the fear of job loss. Zach, would you talk a little bit about the recent work that you've done and the way in which your town hall meeting expresses the work we do, and particularly the approach to the definition of full employment that Phil has so effectively set forth?
Absolutely, Pham. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel today. As you've heard, I teach in a social work program in New Haven, Connecticut, located in the New England region of the northeastern United States. And among my areas of expertise and practice experience in the field of social work is community organization. And so the focus of my portion of the panel is essentially on how we can use this, and how we have used the strategy and tactics associated with this mode of social work practice and activism and movement building more generally to achieve the full employment goals that Dr. Harvey, Dr. Stricker, Dr. Goldberg have outlined. And this builds on what Logan Martinez just talked about our broader efforts to put this into practice. So recently, along with my student intern, Sariana Sabaris, a master's student studying community practice in our social work program, we organized this Good Jobs for All town hall, which was held virtually on September 29th.
I think that was the first of the virtual. We generally, is that right, Logan, that the others were not virtual, they were en person? Yes?
Yeah, that's my understanding, and the
Yeah.
others were physical. Right, Logan? Yep.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't.
Yep. So in organizing this virtual event, and consistent with the current state of practice in social work community organizing, we self-consciously sought to recruit an intersectional group of speakers who represented different facets of the broader struggle for social and economic justice. And so accordingly, we had representatives of the peace movement, the environmental justice movement. We had representatives of the immigrant rights movement, anti-poverty activists, individuals working to address food insecurity, as well as advocates of single-payer national health care, or what we call Medicare for all in the United States. We had speakers who were academics as well as activists, and individuals with lived experience of the damage that unemployment causes, as well as those with professional backgrounds in social work and related fields. And we had a variety of individuals representing different ethnicities, racial groups, ability statuses, among other aspects of identity. We also self-consciously recruited a broad-based group of co-sponsors, some of whom also provided the speakers I just outlined. And in short, one important goal of the event was to bring together as wide a range of individuals and groups as possible around the struggle for full employment, as defined in the manner that Dr. Harvey and others in this panel have outlined. What unites all of these individuals and groups is the recognition that securing employment rights is central to all of our struggles for social and economic justice. And out of this, we hope in Connecticut to build a movement that will put pressure on our elected federal legislators to support legislation that will guarantee a basic human right to employment, what Dr. Harvey correctly calls a right to work, that will guarantee economic security to all, utilizing the full employment bill that Dr. Harvey discussed. And so we've held this meeting, and it represents an effort at consciousness raising among individuals in our state. And in order to carry this forward, what we've now done is to schedule a follow-up meeting, which is going to be held later this month, at which we plan to begin to outline specific strategies and tactics to both raise awareness in our state of the centrality of full employment to all efforts to achieve social and economic justice, and also to specifically discuss how we might influence our federal representatives in Connecticut to support legislation to guarantee good jobs at living wages for all U.S. workers. While it remains to be seen what, excellent, Logan, that's it. While it remains to be seen what concrete steps these plans will yield, we're really hopeful that our recent town hall event has provided then a useful foundation on which we can build. And so, in short, what we are doing in Connecticut is organizing at the local and state level to work for federal full employment policy in an intersectional manner that builds relationships across broader movements for social and economic justice. While there are certainly substantial obstacles given this 40-year era of neoliberalism to which others have referred, we are convinced that community organizing and movement building strategies that we are utilizing will give us the best chance of succeeding in this difficult context. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. And essentially, my look at past efforts suggest insufficient movement building as being a key missing ingredient in the achievement of the original goals of the legislation. So we have an enormous job ahead of us. I might say that we are a largely volunteer organization in which we have some part-time workers, but basically people give enormous amounts of their own time to this organization. June Zacconi, who runs our website, spends enormous amounts of time. She's a trained economist, also an emeritus professor of economics, and so we do need to raise more money to accomplish the kinds of things that we our goals. But there's an enormous dedication here. Our newsletter is almost entirely voluntarily written and edited, etc. Do we have anything in that chat box? If not, I wanted to point out a couple of things, picking up on what Frank Stricker wrote. I looked at December 2019 when the unemployment rate was a low 3.5%. Phil, I think that would have been considered a consonant with the definition of some of those economists that you talked about. Well, that is a mere 5.8 million people. But we add another 4.1 million who are involuntary workers. They'd like full-time work, but they can't get it. And other people who are we call job wanters, another 4.8 million added to that, which are people who aren't actively looking for work but would like to take a job, may be discouraged, may lack transportation, may lack childcare. So that instead of 5.8 million, not exactly a small number, we're talking about 14.7 million and an unemployment rate of 8.7%. Then we talk even about the estimated number of people who who are the working poor, who work year-round, full-time, for less than the 4-person poverty level. That's another 17 million people. So we're dealing with 31, almost 32 million people who are severely disadvantaged in the labor market. And one of the things we do say, that is with this 3.5% official unemployment rate, consonant with some definitions of full employment. And so this way in which we expose the undercount, and you can get it for months and months back just by going to our website, which is, we archive all of those figures for every month for many years back. What we're really showing there is the enormous number of people who are really affected by the lack of a job guarantee. By the way, those rates are calculated on the non-institutional population. It doesn't include the military, doesn't include the prison population, which would probably add another 1% to official unemployment. So that we also, I think, like to think of the political consequences of such an undercount. Because anytime you want to take people to be encouraged to take action on a social problem, you want to say that it's a big problem. If you minimize the size of it, you're really minimizing the politically the ability or the desire to tackle that problem. So I think that just sort of enlarges a little on what Frank, particularly you presented.
Trudy, I have a story I can tell that will add some, color to what you're just discussing. You mentioned the 3.5% unemployment rate in December of 2019. It reminds me of Joe Stiglitz. He is a Nobel Prize winner and an otherwise very progressive economist who was one of the first progressive economists in the late 1990s and early 2000s who began to describe the 4% unemployment achieved at the end of the 1990s as close to full employment. He spoke on the subject of full employment at a conference partly sponsored by the Jobs for All network at Adelphi University, and then at another conference I attended in Geneva, Switzerland, sponsored by the ILO. In both of these conferences, he delivered the keynote speech and was very eloquent in describing the problem of unemployment, the need for full employment, and the negative consequences of our failure to achieve it. I tried to corral him after the Adelphi University talk because he used the term full employment, but never explained how he defined it in his talk. He was literally running to his car, and I wasn't able to talk to him, but I talked to him in Geneva. And I asked him, do you define full employment in terms of job availability or price stability? And he said, without batting an eyelash, price stability. And I asked him, well, what level of unemployment do you think is achievable consistent with that definition? And he told me, well, I think that we can probably achieve 3.5% unemployment. Now,
that's exactly that figure that I worked from.
Exactly that figure. Now, this is the person who more than any other really raised public consciousness about the need to work for full employment early in the 21st century. Yet his economic policy advice is based on a conception of full employment that is deeply flawed and leads to policy advice that is incapable of achieving full employment. So it's a real problem that otherwise progressive economists have gotten on board with this trend that originated in the right-hand wing of the economics profession. And I hope that progressives will seize the opportunity when they have it to challenge progressive economists who refer to full employment to explain exactly what they mean by the term.
Even if they have to chase them to their cars.
Even if you have to chase them to their cars, yes. It's well worth it. It was an enlightening experience for me and was one of the contributing experiences to my decision to write this paper.
Zach, I see that you'd like to make a comment.
Absolutely. A couple of things. I have a comment myself, and then we have a comment in the chat I want to highlight.
Oh, good.
So
we don't want to be talking to ourselves.
Exactly. So I wanted to pick up on the point that you made about the political implications of more accurate definitions of
a social problem, yes.
And social problems more generally. This is something I've long talked about in various venues, particularly around the issue of poverty, which is, of course, also undermeasured to a significant degree, along with unemployment. And the degree to which we can achieve these more accurate, encompassing definitions of these problems of unemployment, of poverty, etc. As you've suggested, these then are perceived as being more salient, more significant, more important problems in needs of being addressed. And I think this is a point that I made in my article on full employment that I wrote for the Journal of Community Practice in the field of social work. And I think it's something that we really need to be emphasizing, and it's part of the community organizing strategies that I talk about in terms of trying to achieve this goal. So absolutely, we want to be doing this and highlighting and using it as a political leverage point to try and get more accurate definitions to then get
the real count is really one of our signature efforts or actions. It's a monthly thing that we do. It can be, you can access it on our website, and as I said, you can do it even archivally as well. Did you say there was somebody in the chat?
I want to highlight first Wesley Jane Wiles' comment, and maybe someone could comment on what he raises. He says, federal job guarantee for the win. Make it a legal right so that unemployed citizens can bring class action suits against their governments. Now, that's an interesting idea.
I think that was originally part of the original Humphrey Hawkins bill. I think that Hawkins wanted people to be able to sue really for that, but I'm not sure. You probably are.
Well, let me comment it. I have great admiration for FDR, and I share with him a skepticism of relying on the courts to achieve economic and social rights. I think we progressives were misled by and continue to be misled by the positive role that courts played during the Warren Court era, and more recently in securing the rights of the LGBTQ community. In the economic and social sphere, however, courts have never been the friend of progressive reform. I think that it is clear that we do need a legally enforceable right to work, but that I would be hesitant to design that legally enforceable right in a way that depended upon courts to enforce it. There are other administrative mechanisms that are both more accessible and easier to control for positive goals than going to the courts. The courts are an ultimate enforcer of the decisions made in administrative proceedings, but they don't control the definitions of the law and the determinations of fact in the same way that they would if cases were brought in court itself. So I'm firmly dedicated to the creation of a legal right to a job, but I think that it needs to be achieved through administrative enforcement within the context of a direct job creation program. And HR 1000 outlines the way that enforcement mechanism would work if anyone's interested. As for Humphrey Hawkins, it actually had a very weak guarantee. It didn't actually guarantee the
original legislation. I think the original
Humphrey Hawkins Act. Yeah. The Humphrey Hawkins Act was a bill introduced into the U.S. Congress in 1974 by a member of Congress,
Augustus Hawkins, yeah.
in the Senate, designed to achieve full employment. It mainly relied on a Keynesian strategy for achieving full employment, but had a backup guarantee to something that could be characterized as a job, but was actually simply enrollment in a standby labor corps that would be provided a monthly stipend in exchange for an obligation to participate in work projects in local communities when called upon. It wasn't really a job as we think of it, a hiring to perform a particular job description for a particular project or organization. But it was an enforceable right to be enrolled in this standby labor corps. I think we can do much better than that. And the design of HR 1000 is based on the assumption that we can actually guarantee real jobs, paying real wages based on hours of work performed in a direct job creation program.
Yes, and I think it's true that neither, I'll get to you in 1 second, Logan, neither of the earlier congressional efforts really made use of the New Deal, of an updated model even of the New Deal direct government job creation approach.
Yeah, Wesley
Neither really specified in a way how living wage jobs could be achieved for all who want them.
Yeah, in the chat box, Warren Wesley Wiles has commented that Warren Mosler likes the idea of being able to establish class action suits for the unemployed. I mean, I think that's understandable. Mosler is a Wall Street financier who happens to support a job guarantee, but his experience with the law is based on its use in that industry. And yes, if we were talking about opportunities to put pressure on corporations, then I think, yeah, I would support class action lawsuit. But as a means of putting pressure on the federal government, I think our strategy has to be political rather than legal.
Logan, you had something to say?
Yeah, a couple things to pick up on that. I mean, I was involved in organizing the unemployed at the time of the Humphrey Hawkins bill. And initially it had, they had an intent to create jobs directly. And it got watered down, and what teeth it had got taken out. And a lot of people, including myself and the people we worked with, were very disappointed in what was finally passed. Loretta Scott King worked on that. The AFL-CIO worked on it. And in the end, we ended up with an empty hat. The way, any of this is ever going to happen, Thomas Jefferson and my good friend Arthur Connell used to point out there's 4 branches of government, and the 4th branch is the people. And as voters and as activists, the only way we're going to get full employment or real wages for people is by a movement. And the people that are here today, we really need you to not only come to panels, but to actually get involved in the movement. And I put our contact information in the chat. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to help. The 3.5% full employment is a total myth. That means that the minority communities, Blacks and Hispanics, that's the bulk of the unemployed women at 3.5%. That means that the communities that are in poverty all over the country will stay in poverty. We need real full employment, not fake full employment. And that's what we're fighting for, and that's what we need your help doing. So join the Jobs for All movement, and let's get it done.
I thank you, Logan. I like to read this following statement by some leading economists who were in favor of full employment at the time of the first attempt in the 1940s. I think it shows how transformative full employment would be, as well as threatening to the economic elites, and the need, therefore, for a very vigorous movement. This is the statement of some leading economists. I think they were Keynesian. I'm sure they were Keynesian economists, Phil. Our experience with periods of labor shortage indicates that its first effect is greatly to increase the bargaining power of labor, both individually and collectively. This results in steady improvement of wages and working conditions, which means that employers must seek to make employment attractive, since the workers are no longer motivated by the fear of losing their jobs. A shift of workers from the less pleasant and remunerative occupations occurs, so that standards are raised at the lower levels. The status of labor will improve, since employers can no longer rely upon the discipline of discharge to enforce authority. The tendency will be for labor to have some participation in industrial and economic policy. So I think that tells you how transformative full employment would be, as well as how threatening it is to economic elites, and therefore politically very, very difficult to accomplish. That, by the way, appeared in the New Republic in the 1940s. I see a chat here applauding the emphasis on the importance of a movement. I did write about that, about the importance of social movements. That piece is on our website. And you also wrote that social movements have obtained in India the NREGA, 100 days at minimum wage, and in France, the experiment of job guarantees in 10 territories in 2017 and 50 in 2020, and we should be well aware of those and look more at them. I wonder if you'd want to write a little piece for us about that for our newsletter. That would be very, very helpful.
Yeah, there's also
Karen, is that right? Van Karen is your name, Gaetan? And no autoplay of audio, sorry. Oh, I don't know what that is. But thank you for those comments.
Yeah, there was also also a very useful example of a limited form of direct job creation program in South Africa. So there are around the world a number of examples of successful job creation programs modeled on the direct government job creation strategy.
I believe we were very much inspired and influenced by the Swedish experiment. Helen Lax Ginsburg, who was one of our co-founders, wrote quite a bit about that in her book on unemployment in the US and Sweden. And I think that model was of importance to us. And the idea that for many years it could be achieved in a democratic capitalist state, social democratic state. I think any other comments from our panel or otherwise? I think we're getting very near our limit, aren't we? 4 minutes, 4 minutes, and we.
I think we should charitably vacate this space and allow our audience to have a cup of coffee.
Yes, and thanks to the panel, and thanks for your participation and hearing what we had to say. Please join us. And by the way, we have had international contacts in the past. I used to go to meetings in Belgium for a while, and we'd really like to hear from you and to have you be part of our movement. Thank you. And thanks to our panelists and for all that they do to further our work and living wage jobs for all.